There's a facility behind a 10-foot fence in Hudson Valley, New York, that most people drive past without knowing it exists. But for 8 straight nights, the staff at Lakewood Canine Rehabilitation Center hadn't slept properly, because in Isolation Room C, a 140-pound Neapolitan Mastiff coal black, blind in his left eye from a scar that wasn't an accident, had turned into something they couldn't control. He'd put 2 handlers in the emergency room. He hadn't eaten in 8 days. The destruction order in the director's top drawer had already been signed, stamped, and dated, just waiting for someone to stop pretending there was another option. They'd brought in specialists, behaviorists, a sedation team from Westchester. Every single one walked out bleeding or shaking or both. The director, a man named Fletcher Boone, who'd never once questioned a piece of paperwork in his life, had already made the call. The dog dies tomorrow. And then, at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, a delivery truck pulled up to the front gate. The woman who stepped out wasn't a specialist, wasn't a trainer, wasn't anyone whose name appeared on any list that mattered. She was 27, underpaid, exhausted, wearing a faded company jacket she'd never thought twice about, carrying 2 boxes of dog food, and she hadn't planned on staying longer than it took to get a signature. But she heard the sound coming from Isolation, not a bark, not a growl, something older and rawer, the kind of sound that tells you a living thing isn't fighting anyone, it's just trying to survive its own grief, and she didn't leave. She set the boxes down, walked past the reception desk, sat on the cold linoleum floor 6 feet from that reinforced door, and did absolutely nothing. No commands, no tools, no credentials. Just a girl who'd moved to her grandmother's farm 10 years ago after the tragic loss of her father, and who understood one thing about broken creatures that nobody in that building had figured out in 8 days. You don't convince something to trust you. You just stay long enough for it to decide. What nobody in that facility knew, what the delivery girl herself didn't know yet, was that the dog had a secret. Every night, for weeks before he turned violent, he'd been escaping, slipping out through the back fence in the dark, running the same 3-mile route, and sitting at the edge of a lake until dawn, waiting for someone. And then one night, whoever he'd been waiting for stopped coming, and the dog broke. If this story hooks you, it's only getting deeper from here. Smash that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear this tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. You don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's go back to that Tuesday morning, to the moment Lena Mercer heard that sound and made a choice that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her own life. Lena Mercer had been sitting on the linoleum floor for exactly 7 minutes when the door at the back of the hallway opened and a young man stepped out, his eyes still red from lack of sleep, a clipboard pressed tight against his chest as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Milo Garner, 24 years old, the morning intake clerk at Lakewood, was the kind of person who told a story before checking whether the story was true. He looked at Lena on the floor, looked at the 2 boxes she had left beside the reception desk, then looked back at her with the expression of someone who wanted to warn her but didn't know where to begin. "You know what's happening in that room, don't you?" he asked, his voice lower than necessary for an empty hallway. Lena didn't answer. Milo told her anyway. The first version was the one he had heard from the night shift the evening before. The dog had bitten a trainer, 6 stitches in the palm, not much blood, but enough to file a report. The second version came from the Westchester anesthesia team, the people who had gone into the isolation room with full restraint equipment and come out less than 3 minutes later. 12 stitches, a possibly cracked wrist, and the team leader said he had never seen any dog move that fast at close range. The third version Milo hadn't heard directly, but had read in the Lakewood staff group chat at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was blood on the wall of the isolation room. Not human blood. The dog's blood from slamming its own head into the reinforced glass until it cracked, and someone had thrown up in the staff restroom after seeing it. Lena didn't know which version was true. She didn't ask, either. She only listened to the way that, each time Milo retold it, the story swelled a little more, fear thickening by another layer, and the dog in that room became something larger than itself, a creature built out of rumor instead of truth. She knew how that worked. She had grown up in a small town where her father died, and the story of his death had swollen in the same way, each person adding one detail, each detail adding a little more drama, until the truth became the smallest thing in the room, and no one bothered to look for it anymore. Milo was still standing there, clearly waiting for her to react. She didn't react. At last, he turned back toward the desk, shaking his head. and Lena sat alone in the hallway, with the sound from isolation room C still slipping through the crack around the reinforced door, low and steady, and not at all like any of the versions Milo had just told her. Fletcher Boone appeared 14 minutes later. She didn't hear his footsteps coming because he wore soft-soled shoes, the expensive kind that administrators of medical facilities usually didn't wear unless they considered their workplace an extension of their living room. He stood over her, looked down, and stayed silent long enough for Lena to understand that this was a man used to using silence as a tool. "You're the delivery employee," he said. "It wasn't a question. You aren't a specialist. You aren't a trainer. And this is a medical facility licensed by the state of New York. You have no reason to be sitting on the floor of my hallway." Lena looked up. She looked straight into Fletcher Boone's eyes and said 4 words he clearly hadn't expected. "I know who I am. Not confrontational. Not defiant. No explanation. No justification. Just a confirmation of a truth so simple that Fletcher couldn't find any place to pry it open." He stood there for a few more seconds, his face tightening in the way of a man who had prepared responses for 10 different forms of resistance, and none of them matched what had just happened. Then he turned on his heel, walked toward the office, and Lena heard the door close, the swivel chair scraping across the floor, the sound of a phone being dialed. He was calling someone. She didn't know who. She only knew that his voice through the thin wall sounded different, lower, more careful, the voice of a man speaking to someone he didn't dare command. 10 minutes passed. Then 10 more. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered faintly in the far corner, the kind of flicker no one repaired because no one stayed here long enough for it to bother them. Lena sat still, and then there were other footsteps, slower, heavier, the footsteps of someone in no hurry because he had spent 30 years walking down long hallways. Walt Pryor passed by her, 58 years old, salt and pepper hair cut short, hands broad and rough in the way of a man who had held leashes and carried injured dogs for 30 years, making it more years than Lena had been alive. He looked at her. She looked back. He said nothing. He kept walking. 10 minutes later, he came back with a paper cup of water in his hand, set it on the floor beside her knee, and walked on again, without saying a single word. Lena picked up the cup, drank, and set it back down on the floor. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She had understood what Walt Pryor had just said with a cheap paper cup of water in an empty hallway. That he didn't know who she was, didn't know what she was doing here, but he had seen enough people walk through that reinforced door and fail, and he wanted to see what made this girl different. 45 minutes. Lena had been sitting on that cold floor for 45 minutes without moving, without speaking, without doing anything that a normal person would call an action. The paper cup of water Walt had given her had been empty for a long time, lying tipped over beside her knee, and the fluorescent light on the ceiling still flickered in the far corner, as if it had been flickering for 20 years, and would keep flickering for another 20 without anyone bothering to replace the bulb. But something in the hallway had changed, and Walt Pryor was the first to notice. He stood at the end of the hall, his back against the wall, his arms folded across his chest in the posture of a man who had kept watch over injured dogs longer than most people held a job, and he tilted his head to one side in a way only people who had spent 30 years listening to the sounds of dogs knew how to do. The sound from isolation room C was still there, still slipping through the gap around the reinforced door, still that low, circling moan the entire building had endured for 8 days, but it had slowed down. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't grown softer. It had only slowed, the space between each loop stretching by 1 second, then 2 seconds, then 3, like the hand of a clock beginning to lose speed when the spring inside no longer had enough force to turn at its old pace. Milo Garner stepped out from the reception desk, his head tilting exactly like Walt's. Even though he didn't have 20 years of experience to understand what he was hearing. "It just got quieter, didn't it?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes moving toward the reinforced door, then toward Lena, then back to the door again. No one answered him. Walt didn't answer because he was listening. Lena didn't answer because she was doing something she hadn't consciously decided to do. It came from a place older than thought, deeper than logic, a place where the body remembered things the mind had forgotten long ago. She made a sound, not speech, not a whistle, not anything that could be written out in letters on paper. 2 short beats, 1 long beat, breath passing through the nasal cavity and vibrating at the back of the throat, the tone low enough to slip through the crack around the reinforced door without needing volume. Her grandmother used to do this. On the farm in Vermont, in winter, when the old sheepdogs panicked because of thunder or because wolves had passed along the edge of the woods, her grandmother would sit down beside them, on the cold barn floor, and make that exact sound. 2 short beats, 1 long beat. Not a command, not a coaxing, just a way of saying through breath that another living creature was here. Calm, not threatening, not going anywhere. Lena didn't remember when she had learned it. She only knew that her hand was lying flat on the cold linoleum floor. Her eyes were closed, and the sound came out of her as if it had been waiting there for 27 years to be used at the right moment. Isolation Room C went silent. Not the empty silence everyone in this building had been praying for through 8 days. A different kind of silence. A silence with weight. The kind that appears when a living creature is deciding. Then Onyx answered. The sound slipped through the crack around the door. And Walt Pryor, with 30 years of working with the most violent, most badly injured, most terrified dogs the system had thrown onto his table, let his folded arms drop and stood up straight, because he had never heard this sound before. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a whine. It was almost soft. Only almost. Rough around the edges in the way of all things that had been pressed down too long. Like the first words of someone who had been silent for months, the voice not yet remembering how to bend properly but still trying because something on the other side of the door had just given it a reason to try. The hallway went completely still. Milo stood at the reception desk with his mouth slightly open. Walt stood at the end of the hall with his hands hanging at his sides, and the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he would need a long while to put into the proper place inside his head. Lena opened her eyes. She didn't turn to look at anyone. She only pressed her hand flatter against the floor and kept her breathing steady, slow, and waited. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the front door of Lakewood opened, and Dr. Cora Whitfield walked in, 42 years old, brown hair tied neatly back, a white coat on her body like armor she had worn through 15 years of veterinary practice, and she carried with her the very specific power of a person with credentials in a building where credentials decided who was allowed to speak and who had to stay silent. She didn't go straight to the isolation room. She stood at the head of the hallway, far enough away that Onyx couldn't sense the new presence, and she observed. She observed Lena on the floor. She observed the reinforced door. She listened to the weighted silence inside the room, the silence that 8 days and 6 specialists hadn't been able to create. She didn't clap, didn't nod in approval, didn't offer any positive comment. She only stood there with the cold, professional expression of someone gathering data before reaching a conclusion, and after 7 minutes, she turned back toward Fletcher Boone's office. Lena heard her voice through the thin wall, not clearly enough to make out every word, but clearly enough to recognize the tone. Calm, authoritative, unyielding. Fletcher said something fast and urgent. Dr. Whitfield answered shorter, slower, and the last sentence was the one Lena heard most clearly, because she said it louder than the rest, not shouting, only in the voice of someone who wanted to make sure there was no room for misunderstanding. Let me watch a little longer. Fletcher's office door opened. He stepped out into the hallway, looked toward Lena, still sitting on the floor, looked toward the reinforced door of isolation, room C, and on his face was the very specific expression of a man holding a euthanasia order that had already been signed, stamped, and dated, only to be told that the order had to wait a little longer, without anyone giving him a specific time for when that waiting would end. Lena stood up. Not quickly, not slowly, just the natural movement of someone who had been sitting long enough to know that the next step couldn't happen on the hallway floor anymore. Her knees were stiff from the cold linoleum. Her back ached in the middle of her spine, in a way she would still feel the next day. But she didn't stretch, didn't rub her legs, didn't make any movement that signaled discomfort. She simply stood straight and looked toward the reinforced door of isolation room C, with the eyes of someone who had made a decision before her body had time to carry it out. At the end of the hallway, Dr. Whitfield was standing with a clipboard in her hand, the pen still unwritten because there was nothing specific enough to write yet. She watched Lena walk toward the door, and on her face was the very brief battle between professional caution and the practical data laid out before her eyes. The dog had been quieter than at any point in the past 8 days, and the only person who had managed to make that happen was walking toward the same door that 6 specialists before her had passed through, before coming back out with blood on their hands. Dr. Whitfield nodded. Not warmly, not encouragingly, Only the nod of a person saying the current data supported this action and she wouldn't stop it. But if that data changed in the next 3 seconds, she also wouldn't apologize for ordering it to stop. Lena turned to Milo. Milo looked at her with the face of someone who wanted to say, "You're insane," but instead read out the 4-digit door code in a trembling whisper. Lena entered the code. The control panel clicked. The light shifted from red to green, and the electromagnetic lock on the reinforced door released with a metallic sound that rang through the empty hallway like a hammer striking. She pushed the door, not all the way open, only wide enough to stand at the threshold, and she stood there, not stepping in, not stepping back, occupying the boundary between two worlds, the hallway with fluorescent light and the smell of disinfectant behind her, the dark room with the smell of damp fur and crystallized fear in front of her. Onyx was in the farthest corner of the room. She saw him for the first time not through glass but with her own eyes, and what she saw made her hold her breathing steady by will instead of instinct. He was larger than she had imagined. 140 pounds of muscle and bone, and the wrinkled skin distinctive to a Neapolitan mastiff, absolutely black from nose to tail, pressing himself into the corner as if he were trying to make his enormous body small enough to disappear. He lifted his head when the door opened. His right eye, the only eye that could still see, amber-colored, found Lena with the absolute precision of a creature that had spent 8 days assessing everything that crossed this threshold and deciding that all of it was a threat. 2 living creatures looked at each other. Lena counted her own heartbeat because she had nothing else to count. 1, 2, 3. Each beat clear inside her chest like a drum in an empty room. 4, 5, 6. Onyx didn't move, didn't growl, didn't make any sound at all, only watched her with that single amber eye and the intensity of a creature weighing a decision whose outcome would determine whether she left this room on her feet or on a stretcher. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Onyx took 1 step toward the door. Only 1 step. His right front paw lifted and came down, the muscles of his shoulder rolling beneath the black folds of skin, his head lowered slightly, but not in an attack posture, in a testing posture. Then he stopped. Lena didn't retreat. She sat down right at the threshold, 1 leg inside the room, the other still in the hallway, her body half belonging to Onyx's world and half belonging to the world she had just left behind. She reached behind her, took a packet of food from the shipment she had delivered that morning, tore open the edge of the bag, poured a little into her palm, and set it down on the floor to her left. She didn't push it toward Onyx. She didn't look directly at him. She looked down at the concrete floor of the isolation room, looked into the empty space between her knees, and she waited. In her peripheral vision, she saw Onyx move, not lunging, not leaping, just the second step, the third, slow, cautious, each step a calculation whose formula she would never know, and as he came closer, she saw his left eye for the first time at a close enough distance. The scar ran from the center of his forehead down across his cheekbone, a long, deep line, healed long ago, but the fur had never grown back there, leaving a pale pink strip against the black. The eye had been surgically closed, the lid stitched shut with sutures some veterinarian had placed with great care, but beneath the short fur around the socket, Lena could still see the old stitch line, faint as the map of a terrible day someone had tried to hide, but the flesh refused to forget. This wasn't an injury from illness. It wasn't an accident. This was a battle wound, the wound of a creature that had put his body between something dangerous and something he had decided to protect. Lena reached out her hand, and she did something that any dog trainer, any veterinarian, any behavior specialist who had walked through this door before her would have called suicidal. She touched his left side, the blind side, the side where Onyx couldn't see her hand coming. She didn't touch the side he guarded, the side where his single amber eye swept every movement with the vigilance of a creature that had learned in blood that the world attacked from the side he could see. She touched the side he had left exposed, the side he couldn't defend, and with that action she told him something no one in this building had told him for 8 days. I'm coming from the place you aren't guarding, and I'm not carrying anything you need to fear. Her fingers touched the black fur on the left side of Onyx's head, lightly, only enough for him to feel warmth and pressure and the presence of human skin against dog skin. Onyx went rigid. All 140 pounds of muscle tightened in an instant, and Lena kept her hand there. Didn't pull away, didn't press harder, only held still, and she heard her heartbeat count 3 more beats before she felt the change beneath her palm. The muscles released. Onyx's head tilted left, leaned into her hand, heavy and warm and trembling faintly in the way she had felt in her grandmother's old sheepdogs when the storm passed and they finally allowed themselves to put their heads down. She didn't move. She left her hand there, let Onyx lean against her for as long as he needed, and with her other hand, she gently pushed the dish of food 1 inch closer. Onyx breathed in. His wet nose touched the edge of the dish, and he ate. Out in the hallway, Milo was standing at the reception desk with both hands gripping the edge of the counter as if the floor had just tilted. Walt Pryor stood at the end of the hall, and he said something very softly, his voice hoarse and broken around the edges. Something 30 years of experience hadn't been enough to keep inside. Milo looked at him. "What did you say?" Walt shook his head. He didn't repeat it. There are things people say when they lose control, and when the moment passes, the words belong to the moment, not to the conversation. 10:30 in the morning. Onyx had eaten every bit of food Lena had placed on the floor and was now lying about 3 feet from her, his head resting on his 2 front paws, his right eye open, but no longer carrying the threat-assessing intensity of the earlier hours. Instead, it held the attentive gaze of a creature watching something he hadn't finished deciding on, but wasn't ready to leave behind either. Lena was still sitting at the threshold, half inside and half outside, her back against the steel doorframe, her left hand still lying flat on the floor on Onyx's blind side, and she had been sitting in that position long enough for numbness to spread from her ankle up to her knee without her bothering to shift. Out in the hallway, Milo was standing at the reception desk, pretending to check admission files on the computer, but his eyes kept flicking toward isolation room C every 30 seconds. Walt Pryor had gone to make coffee for the second time and had returned to his place at the end of the hallway with a steaming paper cup in his hand and the expression of a man watching something he wanted to believe but didn't quite dare to yet. Dr. Whitfield was in Fletcher's office, and through the thin wall Lena could hear her voice, reading something, maybe behavioral data, maybe observation notes, in the steady tone of someone building an argument brick by brick. Then the first sound came not from inside the building, but from outside. Tires on gravel. Heavy, slow, the sound of large tires on a large vehicle. And when Lena tilted her head to look through the hallway window, she saw it. A black Cadillac Escalade. Black from the body to the rims to the glass. The kind of black people didn't buy from an ordinary dealership, but ordered specially because they wanted the car to say one particular sentence before they ever stepped out of it. And that sentence wasn't, "I have money." That sentence was, "Don't ask how I made it." The vehicle stopped right in front of Lakewood's main entrance. The driver's door didn't open. The rear door on the right side opened, and the man who stepped out was Barrett Hale, 46 years old, broad-shouldered, but not with the shoulders of a man who spent his life in a gym. Rather the shoulders of a man who had carried real weight on them for 20 years. Gray suit, no tie, white shirt open at the collar by one button, formal enough to enter any boardroom in Manhattan, but relaxed enough to say he wasn't trying to impress anyone here. Barrett Hale's face was the face of a man managing an empire while the boss of that empire lay in a hospital bed, and it carried every mark of that burden. Shadows under the eyes, a clenched jaw, the crease between his brows carved so deeply it remained there even when he wasn't frowning. He walked through Lakewood's front door, and Fletcher Boone appeared from the office at once, as if he had been standing behind that door ever since making the phone call. Fletcher spoke quickly, quietly, in the voice of a man presenting a problem he wanted someone else to solve. "There was a delivery employee sitting on my floor since this morning. She refuses to leave. She has no authority. She has no credentials. Dr. Whitfield is telling me to wait, and the euthanasia order still hasn't been carried out." Barrett didn't look at Fletcher while Fletcher spoke. Barrett was looking down the hallway, toward isolation room C, toward the reinforced door standing open, and he saw what Fletcher had clearly seen but didn't want to admit the meaning of. The 140-pound dog, who had sent 2 people to the emergency room, was lying quietly on the concrete floor, about 3 feet from a girl in a faded delivery jacket. And he wasn't growling, wasn't moaning, wasn't slamming his head into the wall, wasn't doing any of the things he had done for 8 days. He was just lying there. And he was looking at the girl. Barrett stepped past Fletcher as if Fletcher were part of the wall and walked down the hallway toward Lena. His footsteps sounded against the linoleum. Steady, deliberate, the footsteps of a man used to entering rooms where people stood up when he arrived. Lena didn't stand. She sat at the threshold, looked up at him, and waited. Barrett stopped 4 feet from her, looked into the room, looked at Onyx, then looked back at her. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was low, deep, with none of the false patience Fletcher used, only the pure question of a man who wanted an answer before deciding the next step. "I deliver for Apex," Lena said. Something moved across Barrett Hale's face when she said that name. Not shock, not fear, only the quick, sharp recognition of someone who had just heard a familiar word in an unexpected place. Because Apex Logistics wasn't an ordinary delivery company. It was a company his organization owned. A company whose payroll he approved every month, and the girl sitting on the floor in front of him had been wearing his organization's logo on her chest this entire time without knowing it. Barrett looked at her for another second. "What do you know about this dog?" "I know he's not vicious," Lena said. "He's in pain." Barrett Hale looked at her the way a powerful man looks at someone without power. Not with contempt, not with pity, only with the automatic assessment of someone who had spent his entire life inside hierarchies and was placing her into the proper compartment in the organizational chart inside his head. But Onyx was quiet, and Barrett Hale, whatever else he was, knew how to recognize when reality was saying something different from the plan. He stood still for a long while, looking at the giant black dog, lying on the concrete floor, with his head on his front paws and his right eye, watching the delivery girl with the quiet attention of a creature that had decided at least one human being in this building wasn't a threat. "You have until the end of the day," Barrett said. Behind him, Fletcher Boone stepped forward. "You can't," he began, and Barrett turned to look at Fletcher. Just looked. He didn't speak, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't close his hand into a fist, just looked, with the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years managing an organization where words were unnecessary, and a glance was enough. Fletcher went silent. Whatever sentence he had meant to say died in his throat, and he stood there with his mouth slightly open for another half-second, before closing it and taking one step back, a step he probably didn't even realize he had taken. Barrett turned away, walked back down the hallway toward the front door, past the reception desk where Milo was staring down at the computer screen with the artificial intensity of someone praying no one had just seen him watching, and went outside. He got into the vehicle. The door closed. But the car didn't leave right away. Through the hallway window, Walt Pryor, still standing at the end of the hall with his now cold coffee in his hand, saw Barrett Hale sitting inside the black Escalade with a phone pressed to his ear, talking to someone, and before the dark-tinted glass swallowed his face completely, Walt saw the expression on it. Not anger, not worry, something else, older and heavier, the face of a man who had just remembered something he had buried deep and hoped would stay there. But a 27-year-old girl in a faded Apex jacket had accidentally dug it up without knowing she was holding the shovel. The vehicle drove away. Gravel cracked under the tires. And inside Isolation Room C, Onyx still lay still, his right eye still open, still watching Lena, still waiting. Afternoon came slowly at Lakewood, that particular Hudson Valley afternoon light in this season, heavy gold and slanting low, the kind of light that made everything in the hallway look older and more tired than it really was. Lena had called Paula in dispatch at 11 o'clock and said she wouldn't be running her route today. She didn't explain why, because Paula wasn't the kind of person who asked why. Paula only asked whether she could take the Garrison route that afternoon, and Lena said no. Paula went silent for 2 seconds, then said, "That means you're losing a full day's pay," in a voice that wasn't cruel and wasn't sympathetic either, just the voice of someone reading a line out loud from an employment contract. And Lena said she knew, then hung up. $142 before taxes. That was the price of today, and she would feel it at the end of the month when the rent on her studio in Peekskill came due, and she had to choose between paying enough or eating enough, because she'd never had a month with enough for both. But that was the end of the month. Right now, she was sitting on the floor of Isolation Room C, her back against the concrete wall, and Onyx was lying less than 2 feet from her, closer than he had been in the morning, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body radiating through the cold air of the isolation room. He had eaten for the second time at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Not much, only half a portion, but willingly, without force, and Dr. Whitfield had written that down on her clipboard, with the steady pen strokes of someone collecting evidence. Fletcher hadn't appeared again after Barrett left. His office door stayed shut, and now and then Lena could hear typing through the thin wall, the fast, sharp tapping of someone writing an email to someone else with a very specific purpose. But Lena wasn't thinking about Fletcher. She was thinking about what she had noticed around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sunlight changed angles and began coming through the small window high on the wall of the isolation room, and that light touched the lake in the distance, then reflected back, a thin strip of brightness trembling across the ceiling, and Onyx lifted his head. Not because he was startled, not as a reaction to a sudden sound or movement. He lifted his head and turned his face toward the window, toward the light reflected from the surface of the lake, and he held that position, fixed, continuous. His right eye locked in that direction, with the precision of a compass needle pointing north, not wavering, not losing focus, and Lena realized he wasn't looking at the light. He was looking through the light, through the window, through the afternoon sky, toward the lake. She watched him hold that posture for 15 straight minutes without moving. Then Walt came. He stood at the threshold of the isolation room with 2 paper cups of coffee, handed one to Lena, kept the other, and he too looked at Onyx, staring toward the window. He said nothing for a while, only drank his coffee and observed. Then he spoke, short and low, in the voice of a man sharing information rather than starting a conversation. He keeps facing the lake. Since the first day he got here. Lena looked at him. Walt took another sip of coffee. Milo checked the cameras from back when the dog first arrived. At night, before he started attacking people, before everything got bad, every night around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he tried to get out, scratched at the door, tested the fence, real patient, not panicked, purposeful. He paused. 2 nights back then, he made it. Got through the back fence before the isolation lockdown. Milo found him the next morning in the same old spot in the room, fur wet with dew, mud under his claws. He didn't say more. He didn't need to say more, because Lena had stopped listening the second Walt said every night around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, because the memory had just come back, uninvited, unwelcome, sharp and clear as a blade cutting through still water. And it brought with it the smell of cold asphalt and moonlight on the lake, and the thick, heavy silence of 2 o'clock in the morning in the rural Hudson Valley, when nothing was awake except her delivery van and the things living in the dark. She used to run late-night delivery routes along this lakeside road, the night route, with a $30 bonus for each trip because no one wanted to drive it, and Lena wanted it because $30 was $30, and she had learned not to be picky when she was 19 years old. 3 times, maybe 4, she had driven through the narrow stretch of road that ran close along the edge of the lake, the part where oak trees leaned down near the pavement, and her headlights swept across their trunks like searching fingers. And she had seen it. The first time, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her because she was short on sleep. The second time, she slowed down for only a second, just long enough to confirm that she wasn't imagining it. At the edge of the water, where the short grass met wet gravel, a human shape sat motionless, large, in sleep clothes, thin fabric, gray or pale blue. Lena couldn't tell in the moonlight, eyes open, but not really seeing, not the gaze of someone awake, not the gaze of someone admiring the lake at night, because he liked the quiet. It was empty, with no one home behind those eyes. The look of someone who was in a place his body couldn't follow, sleepwalking. She hadn't known the word for it then. She only knew that the man didn't look right. Looked like someone trapped between 2 worlds and belonging to neither. And beside him, pressed close to his thigh, a massive black shape lay still, not moving, not lifting its head when the headlights of her van swept over it, just lying there, pressing against the man with its whole body, guarding him or keeping him company or both. Lena didn't know how to tell the difference. She had once thought he was homeless. Rural New York had people like that, people living on the edges, sleeping outside, sometimes with a stray dog beside them because loneliness was something both people and dogs tried to cure with another presence. She hadn't stopped. She had driven on, made her deliveries, gone home, slept, and forgotten. Now she sat in isolation room C, with cold coffee in her hand, and Onyx still staring toward the lake through the window, and that memory was no longer the memory of a homeless man with a stray dog. The massive black shape lying against the man's thigh in the moonlight was Onyx. She knew it with a certainty that didn't need proof, the kind of certainty her grandmother called a feeling in the bones, when the body knew before the mind was willing to admit it. And if that black shape was Onyx, then the man, whoever he was, with eyes open but seeing nothing, and thin sleep clothes in the cold Hudson Valley night, was the person Onyx had run to every night, the person Onyx was still looking for in that direction, the person who had stopped coming. "Who owns the dog?" Lena asked, her eyes still on Onyx, not on Walt. Walt stayed silent long enough for Lena to understand that her question had just touched a boundary he didn't intend to let her cross. Then he said, "The man who pays to keep this place running." He stood up, took the empty coffee cup from Lena's hand, and walked toward the end of the hallway without looking back. Lena didn't ask more. She didn't need to ask more. She only needed to look at the way Onyx held his posture toward the lake, patient and absolute and unwavering, and she knew that whoever that man was, whatever he paid for, whatever he owned, this black dog blind in one eye wasn't lying here because he belonged to that man. He was lying here because that man belonged to him, and he was still waiting for him to come back. Lena asked to stay overnight at 6 o'clock in the evening. Fletcher said no, citing safety regulations, liability insurance, and the rule that anyone outside the payroll wasn't allowed to remain in the isolation ward after working hours. Dr. Whitfield waited for him to finish, then said the only 4 sentences she needed to say. "Onyx is more stable when she's nearby. The behavioral data supports it. I'll sign the permission form as chief veterinarian. The condition is that she stays outside the room." Fletcher opened his mouth, looked at Dr. Whitfield, closed his mouth again, and went back to his office and shut the door. At 10 o'clock at night, Lakewood changed its skin. The hallway lights shifted into night mode, pale yellow, enough to move around by, but not enough to read. The building began making sounds that daylight had covered over. The breathing of the other dogs in the rehabilitation wing on the other side of the wall. The low hum of the air conditioner in the vents, the trembling of pipes somewhere downstairs. The smell of disinfectant mixed with damp fur, a smell that became heavier at night because there was nothing else to compete with it. Lena sat on a plastic chair in the hallway, the folding kind someone had brought out from the staff break room, probably Walt, because it had been there when she came back, and no one admitted to placing it there. A notebook lay on her lap, a hard-covered notebook bought at the dollar store in Peekskill, with a blue ballpoint pen clipped into the spine. She wrote, 10:17, Onyx lying close to the room door, head facing the door, right eye open, breathing rate 14 breaths per minute. Then she waited. 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning. The notes grew shorter because nothing changed enough to write at length. 2:15, breathing slightly elevated. 16 breaths, 2:30. 18 breaths. Onyx lifts head, then lowers it. Something is building inside the dog, slow and steady, like pressure rising with no valve anyone knows how to open. 2:47. Exactly. Not 2:45, not 2:50, 2:47. Onyx stood up. Lena heard it before she saw it. Claws on concrete. 4 slow, purposeful steps. The footsteps of a creature that knew exactly where it wanted to go. He came to the door and scratched. Lightly, rhythmically, patiently, not frantic scratching, not lunging, not like the 8 days before, when he had slammed his head into the reinforced glass until it cracked. This was different scratching. His claws tapped against the steel in a repeating pattern, like someone knocking on the door of a house where they knew someone was inside. Knocking, then waiting, then knocking again, with the absolute patience of one who believed the door would open because it always had. Lena looked through the reinforced glass panel and understood. He wanted to go outside. Not to escape, not out of fear. He wanted to go to the lake. 2:47 in the morning. Every night. The schedule unchanged, even though the person he was waiting for hadn't come in more than 8 days, maybe longer, because this schedule didn't run on logic. It ran on something older than logic. Loyalty that didn't know how to turn itself off. Loyalty that kept its schedule after everything else had fallen apart. Lena opened the reinforced door, only the door between the isolation room and the hallway, not the door leading outside. Onyx stepped out, his claws clicking on the linoleum, his head turning at once toward the hallway window, toward the lake. And he stood there staring into the darkness beyond the glass, where the surface of the lake lay somewhere he couldn't see but knew by scent or by memory or by something human beings had no organ to measure. 30 seconds. Then he turned and looked at Lena. His amber right eye in the dim light seemed almost to glow. He looked at her, she looked back, and he seemed to find enough of whatever he needed on her face, because he stepped over, circled once around where she sat, then lay down and dropped his head onto her lap. Heavy, warm, the smell of black fur mixed with disinfectant and cold concrete. Lena placed her hand on his head, on the blind side, gently, and with her other hand, she opened the notebook and wrote, 2:47 in the morning. Onyx wakes, goes to door, scratches lightly in rhythm, oriented toward lake, allowed into hallway, stands at window about 30 seconds, comes to me, lies down, head on lap. Breathing decreases, 14 breaths per minute. No agitation. She wrote every detail, because her grandmother had taught her before she died that if you see something important, you write it down. Don't trust memory, because memory disappears, but paper stays. Paper doesn't forget. Paper doesn't change the story every time you open it. Lena at 9 years old hadn't understood. Lena, at 27, sitting on the cold floor at 3 o'clock in the morning, with 140 pounds collapsed across her lap, understood that this $1 notebook might be the only thing standing between the dog and the paper in Fletcher Boone's drawer. 7 o'clock in the morning. Lena was still sitting on the hallway floor with Onyx's head collapsed in her lap when the sound of tires stopping in front of Lakewood pulled her out of the half-awake, half-asleep state she had drifted into without knowing when. Not the sound of the Escalade's tires from yesterday. Lighter, cleaner, the sound of the kind of sedan people bought because it didn't draw attention, not because it was cheap. Onyx lifted his head from her lap, ears rising, his right eye turning toward the front door, and Lena felt the muscles beneath his black fur tighten, then slowly release. Not a threat response, but a recognition response, as if some scent or sound from the doorway belonged in the category marked known inside his private system of classification. The man who stepped through Lakewood's front door at 2 minutes past 7 was Tommy Rourke, 31 years old, wearing a black crewneck shirt, fitted closely enough to show shoulders and arms built by something more disciplined than an ordinary gym, a square jaw, hair clipped close to the skin at both sides, and eyes that swept the hallway the way only a trained person's eyes swept. Front left corner, rear right corner, emergency exit, the position of every person in the space, all of it in less than 2 seconds before he looked straight ahead and kept walking. Milo at the reception desk sat up straighter at once, by an instinct even he couldn't explain. The automatic reaction of a body recognizing that the person who had just entered the room belonged to a different classification than an ordinary visitor. Tommy didn't stop at the desk. He walked straight down the hallway, his footsteps making no sound, the kind of step trained to move across any surface without announcing itself, and stopped in front of the glass door of Isolation Room C. He looked in. Onyx was lying on the hallway floor beside Lena, his head resting on his 2 front paws, his right eye open but not tense, his breathing even at a rate Dr. Whitfield would record as stable. Tommy looked at that scene for a long time. Not the assessing look Barrett had worn yesterday, not Fletcher's skeptical look. The look of a man comparing what was in front of him with something inside his head that he had carried for weeks and hadn't told anyone, because Tommy Rourke knew something most people in the organization didn't know. His boss sleepwalked. Not the mild kind of sleepwalking where people went into the kitchen for water and then returned to bed. The kind of sleepwalking where his boss walked out of the mansion at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning in sleep clothes, eyes open, unconscious, crossed the yard, crossed the grass, went down the dirt road behind the house, and sat at the edge of the lake until nearly dawn before returning to bed on his own with no memory of it. Every night, Tommy stood about 164 feet away, keeping watch, not interfering because the doctor said waking a sleepwalker could cause shock, and because his boss was the kind of man for whom knowing someone had seen him in that state would be worse than any sleepwalking episode. Tommy had kept that secret for 2 years, and Tommy had seen Onyx. He had seen the huge black dog crawl through Lakewood's back fence at night, run 3 miles through oak woods and dirt roads, and come sit beside his boss at the lake's edge. No barking, no waking him, only sitting close against the thigh of the sleepwalking man and lying still there until his boss stood up on his own and went back. Tommy hadn't interfered because for the first time in 2 years, his boss's sleepwalking face, usually blank as a mask, had held something almost like peace when the dog was beside him. Not happiness, not relaxation, just one layer less of something Tommy didn't have a word for but could recognize with his eyes. Tommy pulled a photograph from his inner jacket pocket, not a photo on a phone, a printed photograph, glossy paper, 4 by 6 inches, and he handed it to Lena without saying a single word of explanation. Lena took the photograph. In it, a man standing beside Onyx, black suit, white shirt, no tie, his right hand resting on the dog's head with the naturalness of someone who had made that gesture thousands of times. Behind them was the lake, the same lake Onyx had stared toward through the window all day yesterday. The man's face in the photograph was cold, controlled, jaw clenched, eyes looking into the camera with the intensity of someone used to being looked at and used to making the person looking turn away first. Dangerous. That was the first word Lena thought when she looked at that face, and immediately after that, she realized that this face and the shadowed figure she had seen by the lake on those late-night delivery routes couldn't possibly belong to the same human being. The man in the photograph looked like something the world stepped around. The figure by the lake looked like something the world had forgotten. But they were one and the same. Tommy watched her looking at the photograph, and after a while he said, his voice low, flat, with no question in it, "You've seen him before." Lena looked up. "By the lake," she said, "several times." Tommy didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't confirm, didn't deny. He only looked at her for 3 more seconds, with the eyes of a man weighing how much this information changed and whether he ought to be worried. Then he turned away, walked down the hallway, passed Milo without looking at him, went out the front door, got into the car, and drove away. The sound of the black sedan faded over the gravel. Lena sat with the photograph in her hand. She looked at the man's face in the picture one more time, looked at his hand on Onyx's head, looked at the lake behind them, then turned the photograph face down on her lap, because she needed a minute to process the reality that the man who owned the dog with his head collapsed in her lap was the same man she had driven past in the night without stopping, sitting alone at the water's edge with open eyes that saw nothing, and she had thought he was homeless, and she hadn't stopped, and now she wished she had stopped, even though she didn't know what that would have changed. At the same time, Tommy Rourke drove the black sedan away from Lakewood, 60 miles south, inside an oak-paneled office on the 14th floor of a building on Park Avenue, with no nameplate in the lobby, because the people who needed to know where it was already knew. Vance Holbrook set his phone down on the desk and looked at it as if the phone had just insulted him. 52 years old. Salt and pepper hair combed back without a single strand out of place. Custom-tailored charcoal suit, silver-gray silk tie, and a face made for sitting at the head of conference tables. The kind of face people looked at and saw authority before they saw a human being. Vance Holbrook was the consigliere of the Corsini family, legal and strategic advisor, the man who stood directly behind Dario in the structure of power and directly ahead of everyone else, and he had just received word from Fletcher Boone that the euthanasia order for Onyx had been postponed indefinitely because Barrett Hale had allowed a delivery employee to sit on the floor, and the dog had suddenly become obedient. Vance didn't care about the dog. Vance had never cared about the dog. Not when Dario brought him home to the mansion 6 years ago. Not when he lost an eye jumping between Dario and a bullet 2 years ago. Not when he was transferred to Lakewood after Dario was shot. A dog was a dog, but a symbol was different. If Onyx was euthanized while Dario lay in the hospital, it would be proof, not legal proof, but proof in the language Vance's world spoke. Proof that Dario had lost control, that the Corsini empire was bleeding from cuts no one had bothered to stitch, that if even the boss's dog couldn't be protected, then who could be? A power vacuum. That was what Vance had seen 3 weeks earlier, when the bullet tore through Dario's shoulder, before someone called someone and that bullet was arranged in a way Vance knew but no one could prove, and he had prepared for that vacuum with the patience of a man who played chess, not cards. One piece at a time, one move at a time, no hurry, no noise. Now a 27-year-old delivery girl had just slowed his clock, and Vance Holbrook wasn't the kind of man who accepted being slowed down. He picked up the phone and made 3 calls in 15 minutes, each call shorter than the one before, then summoned the family council for an emergency meeting in the conference room on the 15th floor at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Corsini family conference room didn't look like a conference room in the movies. No round table, no red leather chairs, no oil portrait of an ancestor on the wall, just a rectangular wooden table, 8 chairs, a water pitcher, and natural light from windows overlooking Park Avenue that no one in the room ever bothered to admire. 5 people sat around the table. Vance at the head, Barrett Hale, midway down the right side with the face of a man who knew he had been called in to explain himself, not to be consulted, and 3 other senior members, whom Vance had chosen carefully, because he knew which way they would listen when the wind blew in the right direction. Vance opened in a calm, professional voice, the voice of a lawyer presenting before a court. Barrett Hale was allowing an unknown delivery employee, with no verified background, no authority, and no credentials, to access the boss's personal property while the boss was in the hospital and unable to make decisions. This was a security matter. Barrett opened his mouth. Vance continued. and Barrett had signed the euthanasia order for the dog without informing Dario. Barrett closed his mouth. The entire room looked at him, and Barrett knew that any sentence he spoke now would be a noose he tied around his own neck. Because if Dario learned that Barrett had signed an order to kill Onyx while Dario was lying in a hospital bed, Barrett's 20-year career wouldn't end with a bullet, but with a look. And that look would be worse than a bullet. Vance let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to feel its weight. Then he opened his mouth to begin the proposal. The conference room door opened. No one knocked. No one announced him. The door simply opened, and the man who walked in was Gideon Pratt, 67 years old, hair completely silver, dark blue suit cut in the style of the previous decade but fitted down to the millimeter because his measurements hadn't changed in 20 years, and the walk of a man who didn't need anyone to open doors for him because every door in this world opened when he arrived. Gideon Pratt had retired 5 years ago, lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, played golf on Wednesdays, went to church on Sundays, and no one dared call him back unless the ground was on fire. No one had called him. He had come on his own. He stood at the head of the table opposite Vance, didn't sit, and looked around the room once, slowly, his eyes stopping on each face long enough for every person to feel they had just been read. Then he said, "I hear you're all meeting to decide whether to kill the kid's dog." Silence, the kind of silence that not even the traffic on Park Avenue 14 floors below could pierce. "That dog lost an eye for the kid," Gideon said, his voice no louder than ordinary conversation, but carrying the weight of the man who had taught Dario's father everything Dario's father knew before Dario's father was killed. "The kid is in the hospital because of a bullet someone in this room may have known about ahead of time." His eyes moved and stopped on Vance. No accusation. Gideon Pratt never accused, because accusation meant he needed evidence. And he didn't need evidence. He only needed the look and the silence that followed it. His gaze stayed on Vance for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to see, long enough for Vance to feel it on his skin. "Meeting's over," Gideon said. He turned his back and walked out. No one objected. Barrett stood, gathered his papers, and left the room without looking at anyone. The 3 senior members followed one by one. Vance remained sitting alone in the empty conference room, afternoon light from the Park Avenue windows falling across the wooden table, and he rose slowly, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the door with a perfectly calm face. But in the hallway, when no one was looking, the fingers of his right hand tapped against his thigh. 1, 2, 3. Then stopped. Vance Holbrook didn't retreat. Vance Holbrook never retreated. He only changed direction. Tommy Rourke called Lena at 3 o'clock that afternoon, 2 hours after the council meeting in Manhattan broke up, a meeting Lena knew nothing about. He spoke briefly. Barrett called. "The boss wants to meet the person who made the dog eat. I'll pick you up in 40 minutes. Then he hung up before Lena could ask who the boss was, though she already knew who the boss was because the photograph Tommy had given her that morning was still in the pocket of her Apex jacket. The glossy side turned against the fabric, and she had felt it there every time she put her hand in her pocket all day, like a pebble she couldn't throw away. She handed Onyx over to Walt, gave him a brief report on breathing rate and feeding times, and Walt nodded without asking where she was going, because Walt was the kind of man who understood that there were questions whose answers would place him somewhere he didn't want to be. The black sedan stopped in front of Lakewood, exactly 40 minutes later. Lena got in, sat in the back seat, and Tommy drove onto the highway heading south toward Manhattan, without saying anything for the first 10 minutes. Lena watched the Hudson Valley slide backward beyond the window. Oak trees and low hills and houses set far back behind long lawns, scenery beautiful in the indifferent way. Only places with money could afford to be beautiful. And she asked, "Who owns Apex?" Tommy didn't look in the rearview mirror. His hands on the steering wheel didn't tighten, didn't move. But the silence stretched 3 seconds too long for a simple question. And that silence was an answer all by itself. Lena asked again, "My father worked at the Yonkers docks. Did those docks belong to the same person?" Tommy looked straight at the road. "I'm not the person who should answer that question." He said it in a flat voice, not evasive, not apologetic, the voice of someone drawing a very clear line on the ground between 2 people, and saying that he stood on this side, she stood on that side, and he wouldn't cross it. Lena didn't ask anything else. She looked out the window and let the silence say the rest. Apex belonged to the same person who owned Onyx, owned Lakewood, and might have owned the docks where her father had fallen into the water 10 years earlier while no one asked why. The car stopped in front of a brownstone building on the Upper East Side, whose facade looked more like a private club than a hospital. Lena stayed in the car for another 60 seconds after Tommy turned off the engine. He didn't hurry her, didn't ask, only sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the steering wheel and waited, because he was the kind of person who understood that those 60 seconds weren't hesitation but processing. And what Lena was processing was the reality that she was about to walk into the room of a man she had seen sleepwalking by the lake. A man whose dog she had held in her lap all night, and a man whose organization might be tied to her father's death. She stepped out of the car. 2 guards stood in the lobby, 2 more in the 3rd-floor hallway. And when Tommy opened the room door for her, Lena entered a space that looked more like a high-end hotel suite than a hospital room. Wood floor, linen curtains, a leather armchair, a bedside table with a vase of fresh flowers. Someone changed every day, except for the medical equipment at the head of the bed and the faint smell of disinfectant that no flower could fully cover. Dario Corsini lay in the bed, 37 years old, his upper body wrapped in white bandages, his left shoulder immobilized in a sling. And when Lena crossed the threshold, he looked up from the tablet in his hand, with the speed of a man who didn't like being surprised and had trained his whole life never to be surprised. He looked at her, quick, precise, from her worn-soled sneakers to her old jeans, to the Apex jacket faded at the shoulders to her face. And when his gaze reached her eyes, he stopped. Not stopped because his assessment was finished, stopped because she looked back at him, and the way she looked back didn't fit any category he was used to sorting. Not fear. People who entered Dario Corsini's room usually carried at least one thin layer of fear beneath whatever expression they wore on the outside. Not defiance. She wasn't trying to seem strong, wasn't trying to prove anything. She only looked, with the eyes of someone who had sat on a linoleum floor for 24 hours and had no room left for any expression that wasn't true. "You're the one who made Onyx eat," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm the one who sat on the floor long enough," Lena said. A moment hung between them. Not uncomfortable silence, not tense silence, only the kind of moment in which 2 people were measuring the distance between them with something other than their eyes. Then Dario asked about Onyx, and the way he asked let Lena know that whatever else he was outside this room, inside this room, he was someone who truly cared about the dog. Not the way an owner asked about property, the way someone asked for every small detail, how he lay down, how he breathed, whether he slept deeply or only lightly, how much he ate, whether he let anyone else touch him. Lena told him. She told him how Onyx kept his face turned toward the lake through the window. Fixed, continuous, as if the lake were a person, and he was speaking to that person. She told him about 2:47 in the morning, how he woke at the exact time, scratched the door in a steady rhythm, patient, waiting. She told him about his breathing when he dropped his head into her lap, 14 breaths per minute, even, heavy. Dario listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask over her, his eyes never leaving her face the whole time she spoke. And across that cold, controlled face, something was moving beneath the surface, slow and heavy, like water running beneath ice, visible only for an instant at the edge. When Lena stopped, the room went quiet. The conversation had reached a border they both felt. The border between the dog and everything else. Between Lakewood and the lake. Between the delivery girl and the kingpin in the hospital bed. And both of them stood at that border, looking across to the other side without yet stepping over. Lena stood up from the leather armchair beside Dario's bed. The conversation had lasted 20 minutes, and she could feel that the boundary neither of them had crossed was still there. As clear as the glass wall between the isolation room and the hallway at Lakewood, something they could see through but couldn't touch. She said thank you because she didn't know what else to say, and she walked toward the door, and her hand had just touched the knob when Dario said behind her, "Mercer." She stopped, not because she decided to stop, but because her body recognized something before her mind had time to process it. Recognized that the way he said her last name wasn't the way people read an unfamiliar name, but the way people spoke a name they already knew, had already thought about, had already prepared for this moment. "Was your father's name Frank?" Lena froze, her hand on the doorknob, her fingers tightening around the cold metal, her back turned to Dario, and she didn't turn around because she knew that if she turned around now, her face would say everything her mouth was holding back. "You knew my father?" she asked. Her voice was flatter than she thought it would be, but there was a slight tremor at the end of the sentence that she didn't have time to crush. Silence. Not the silence of someone thinking of an answer, but the silence of someone who already had the answer and was weighing how much of it to give. The heaviest silence Lena had ever heard, heavier than the silence in the isolation room at 2:47 in the morning, heavier than the silence between her and Tommy in the car, so heavy she could feel it pressing down on her shoulders like something with physical weight. "Not directly," Dario said. 2 words. Lena stood at the door with those 2 words, and she understood at once that not directly didn't mean no. Not directly meant there was a road connecting the man in this hospital bed to her father, and that road was long enough for him not to have to look straight at it, but short enough for him to know it was there. She opened the door and stepped out without saying another word. The hallway of the private hospital had thick carpet and warm lights, and the smell of lilies from the vase at the reception desk. All of it designed to make people forget they were inside a building full of wounds, but Lena saw nothing except the elevator doors at the end of the hall. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She stepped in, the doors closed, and inside the sealed air of the elevator with soft music playing through the ceiling speaker, her hands shook, not from fear, but from something rising out of the place where she had buried it 10 years ago. Something she had forced down every time it tried to surface. Every birthday her father wasn't there. Every anniversary of his death when her mother cried alone in the kitchen before her mother died too. Every night in the Peekskill studio when she lay staring at the ceiling and wondered why the police never called back, why no one ever asked even one more question. Tommy drove her back to Peekskill. 40 minutes on the highway, oak trees and low hills sliding backward past the window in the late afternoon light, and no one said anything. Tommy didn't ask how the meeting went. Lena didn't tell him. And the silence between them this time wasn't the silence of someone holding a boundary, but the silence of 2 people who both knew something had just changed, and neither of them was ready to name it. Tommy stopped in front of her studio building in Peekskill. Lena said thank you. Tommy nodded, and she stood on the sidewalk watching the black sedan drive away until the taillights disappeared at the end of the street. That night, the small studio, 1 room, the kitchen joined to the living room, joined to the bedroom, the window overlooking the parking lot, the fluorescent kitchen light flickering because she had never called anyone to fix it. Lena sat at the kitchen table, opened the old laptop whose cooling fan hummed every time it ran, and typed into the search bar, Frank Mercer Yonkers Waterfront. The first result. An article from the Yonkers Daily, 10 years earlier, 4 paragraphs. Dock worker falls to death at Yonkers Pier. Frank Mercer, 43 years old, a dock worker, fell from Pier number 7 on Friday night. His body found Saturday morning by the early shift crew. No witnesses. No cameras in that area at the time of the incident. Police concluded it was a workplace accident. No further investigation. 4 paragraphs. Her father's entire life folded into 4 paragraphs in a local newspaper that probably no one read except her mother and her grandmother and the police officer who wrote the report, put it in a drawer, and forgot. File. Sealed. Case. Closed. Lena read those 4 paragraphs 3 times. Then she closed the laptop, sat still at the kitchen table, and looked at the Apex jacket hanging over the back of the chair across from her. The company logo printed on the left chest, white letters against dark blue, faded from too many washes. Apex Logistics. The company she had worked for 3 years. The company that belonged to the organization that owned the Yonkers docks. The docks where her father had fallen into the water 10 years ago while no one asked why. She had worn that logo on her chest for 3 years. Every early morning, zipping the jacket up, every late afternoon, taking it off and hanging it over the chair. 3 years, and she had never thought about it twice, because it was only a jacket, only a job, only rent money at the end of the month. Now she looked at it and saw what her grandmother called a feeling in the bones, the intuition that had no proof, only the bones knew. And 10 years of that intuition was finally taking shape, not the shape she wanted, but a shape. A week passed, and Lena lived between 2 worlds without belonging to either one. By day she was at Lakewood with Onyx. By night she went back to her Peekskill studio and opened her laptop on the kitchen table, then closed it again, without searching for anything more, because she had already found enough to know that searching further meant stepping through a door she wasn't ready to step through. She missed 3 more delivery shifts that week, calling Paula every morning to say she wouldn't be in, and Paula stopped asking why by the 3rd day, because Paula understood that people didn't give up wages unless something mattered more than wages, and for someone earning $142 a day, that something had to matter very much. Onyx improved. That was a fact no one at Lakewood could deny, no matter how hard Fletcher Boone tried. On the third day of the week, Dr. Whitfield signed the order to move Onyx from Isolation Room C to Recovery Room B, a room with a larger window, medical mat flooring, steadier temperature, and natural light in the morning instead of only reflected light in the afternoon. Onyx ate consistently, 2 meals a day, on time, willingly. He slept more deeply, not the shallow sleep of the first week when he lay with one eye half open, guarding every movement, but the kind of sleep where his ribs rose and fell slowly, and his legs sometimes twitched faintly to the rhythm of dreams Lena hoped weren't nightmares. He allowed 3 people to touch him: Lena, Walt, and Dr. Whitfield, in that order, with descending levels of trust that Dr. Whitfield recorded in her official report in clinical language. Subject displays graduated trust response with primary attachment to civilian observer, secondary to facility staff, tertiary to attending veterinarian. Translated into ordinary language. The dog trusted Lena most, Walt second, Dr. Whitfield third, and everyone else still remained outside the fence. Dr. Whitfield gave her official assessment on the 5th day. Onyx had shifted from a defensive response to an attachment response, meaning he no longer saw the world as a collection of threats he needed to fight off, but was beginning to see at least one small part of the world as a place where something was worth staying for. But every night, at 2:47, Onyx still got up. Lena stayed at Lakewood every night that week, sleeping on the plastic hallway chair with a thin blanket Walt had brought from storage, and every night she witnessed the same thing. 2:47, not off by a minute, Onyx woke, walked to the recovery room door, and looked out the window toward the lake. No more scratching, no ramming, only standing there and looking, patient, motionless. And after 15 or 20 minutes, he turned back and lay down again. Lena recorded it every night in her notebook. Time, duration, behavior, response, after returning to his bed. 7 nights. 7 entries identical down to the details. The second front opened on the 4th day, when Barrett Hale called Dr. Whitfield at 8 o'clock in the morning in the voice of a man who had just received bad news before breakfast. Fletcher Boone had filed an official complaint with the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. The content of the complaint, the dog classified as dangerous in Lakewood's records, was being given behavioral intervention by an individual with no veterinary degree, no animal training certification, no professional authority of any kind, while a valid euthanasia order was still awaiting enforcement. If the department became involved, and they would because the complaint had been written in the correct form, with the correct terminology, through the correct channel, then the process was automatic. Site inspection, classification reassessment, and if the dog still remained in the dangerous category, the euthanasia order wouldn't be an option but a requirement under state law. Barrett knew Vance was behind it. Not because there was proof, but because Fletcher Boone wasn't smart enough to write a complaint in legal language precise down to every comma. And Vance Holbrook was. But knowing and proving were 2 things living on opposite banks of the river, and Barrett was standing on the bank with no bridge. The complaint, technically, was entirely valid. Everything Fletcher wrote in it was true. Lena had no degree, Onyx was still in the dangerous classification, the euthanasia order still existed on paper. Correct truths arranged in the wrong order to create a false conclusion, and that was the art Vance Holbrook had spent his whole life practicing. Barrett called Dr. Whitfield again that afternoon, and asked what she needed to stop the complaint before an inspector from the department arrived. Dr. Whitfield said she needed 2 things. An official behavioral assessment signed by her proving that Onyx was in a grief response, not an aggression pattern, meaning that his earlier violent behavior had been the grief response of an animal who had lost his owner, not an inherently vicious nature. And second, she needed data to support that assessment, data with specific times, behavior notes in sequence, and evidence of the shift from defense to attachment, observed continuously over multiple days. Barrett asked where that data was. Dr. Whitfield said, "In the delivery girl's notebook. The $1 hard-covered notebook, blue ballpoint pen, small compressed handwriting, bought at the Peekskill dollar store, 7 nights of continuous notes, time, behavior, response, breathing rate, distance. Every detail marked with a time accurate to the minute." Lena hadn't known when she wrote those lines in the dim hallway at 3 o'clock in the morning that they would become the only thing standing between Onyx and a second euthanasia order. Her grandmother had been right. Paper stayed. Dario Corsini was discharged on the 14th day after being shot, 4 days earlier than the doctor recommended. Because Dario Corsini wasn't the kind of patient who listened to doctors, and his doctor wasn't the kind of doctor who dared to force him. Tommy drove the black sedan from Manhattan back to the Hudson Valley mansion, and before the car had fully stopped in the garage, before Dario stepped into the house, before he saw his desk or his bed or anything else belonging to the life the bullet had torn a hole through, he said 2 words to Tommy. To Lakewood. Tommy didn't ask why. Tommy never asked why. He simply drove, and 15 minutes later, the sedan stopped in front of Lakewood's gate for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. And Dario stepped out, slower than usual because his left shoulder still hurt, though he wouldn't admit that to anyone, not even Tommy. Milo at the reception desk sprang to his feet like a released coil when he saw Dario walk through the door, because Milo had never met Lakewood's owner. But he recognized power when it entered a room, power that didn't need a nameplate or an introduction, only the way a person occupied space. Dario walked straight down the hallway toward the recovery ward, Tommy 3 steps behind him, and he had made it 2/3 of the way down the hall when Lena appeared at the other end. She didn't block his path. She only stood there, her hands at her sides, the faded Apex jacket on her body, her notebook tucked into her back pocket, and she watched him come closer, and when he was about 6 feet from her, she said, "My father, Frank Mercer, Yonkers Docks, 10 years ago." Dario stopped. His steps stopped, his body stopped, and something on his face stopped with it. The controlled expression he had worn like armor for 37 years, cracking slightly at the corner of one eye, so small that only someone standing close enough would see it. The hallway was quiet. Onyx's breathing drifted out from Recovery Room B through the half-open door. Steady, 14 breaths per minute. A sound Lena had memorized after 7 nights of notes. Walt's footsteps sounded far away in the recovery area on the other side of the building. Slow and even as they were every day. Tommy stood behind Dario, motionless, his eyes sweeping the hallway by reflex. But his body said he knew this wasn't a situation that needed intervention. This was a situation that needed stillness. Dario could lie. Lena knew that, and Dario knew Lena knew it. But they also both knew that lying now wouldn't buy him anything, because she had seen him before. She knew his name, seen him at the edge of the lake, in thin sleep clothes, with open eyes that saw nothing, the most naked version of him. The version even Tommy had only been allowed to see from 50 meters away. And she had seen it closer. And she wasn't afraid, and lying to someone who had seen the human being before seeing the mask was a useless act. Dario Corsini was smart enough not to commit. "Vance Holbrook," he said. His voice was low, flat, with no emotion slipping through that he didn't allow. He was managing the docks at the time. "Your father found contraband in warehouse number 3 and planned to report it to the police. Vance handled it without reporting it upward." "When did you know?" Lena asked. "I discovered the truth long after the dust had settled, while auditing the old territory records Vance kept hidden. By then the damage was done, and removing him immediately would have triggered a war within the ranks that we weren't ready to fight." He paused. "You have the right to hate me." Lena stood still. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't say whether she hated him or didn't, because the truth was, she didn't know yet. She was standing between 10 years of losing her father and 2 weeks of holding this man's dog in her lap at 3 o'clock in the morning, and those 2 things hadn't found a way to live together inside her head. She looked through the glass door of Recovery Room B. Onyx had stood up. Not because he was startled, not because he sensed a threat, but for the first time in 2 weeks, he had risen on his own, because he heard Dario's voice, the voice he had waited for at the lake's edge every night, the voice he hadn't heard in more than 3 weeks, and now he was standing in the recovery room, with his right eye wide open, ears raised, all 140 pounds of him aimed toward the door with absolute attention. "I didn't stay because of you," Lena said, her eyes still on Onyx through the glass. "I stayed because of him." She stepped aside, giving him the hallway. Dario looked at her for another second, a look Lena couldn't decode and didn't try to decode. Then he went to the recovery room door, opened it, and stepped inside. Onyx surged forward, not in attack, but with 140 pounds of loyalty, held back for 3 weeks, breaking open in a single moment. His enormous head pushing into Dario's chest so hard that Dario, his left shoulder still hurting, hit the wall with his back and caught the doorframe with his right hand to keep his balance. He didn't push the dog away. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor, on the medical matting of Recovery Room B, and Onyx rubbed his head against his neck, his shoulder, his chest, his wet nose buried in the fabric of his shirt, and Dario placed his right hand on the dog's back and held him. And his face, the face Lena had seen in the photograph, cold as steel, and in the hospital bed controlled like a mask, that face controlled nothing anymore. Not crying. Dario Corsini wasn't the kind of man who cried, but something close to crying, something the muscles of the face did when the final line of defense fell, and the human being inside stepped out into the light, even if only for a few seconds. Walt Pryor stood at the end of the hallway. No one knew when he had arrived, and he looked at the scene inside Recovery Room B through the glass. And then he turned his face away, slowly, toward the recovery ward on the other side of the building, because there were moments that didn't belong to the person watching, but to the person living them, and Walt Pryor had lived long enough to know the difference. 2 weeks after the day Dario sat on the floor of Recovery Room B holding Onyx, everything at Lakewood had fallen into the kind of rhythm people mistook for peace, when in truth it was only the quiet between two storms. Onyx was still at Lakewood because Dr. Whitfield refused to sign the transfer papers until she completed the second phase of her behavioral assessment, the kind of assessment that required 2 more weeks of continuous observation in a controlled environment. And Dario agreed reluctantly, because even though he owned Lakewood on paper, he also understood that arguing with a veterinarian about recovery time was a battle money couldn't win. Instead, he came to visit Onyx every day. Tommy drove, 15 minutes from the mansion. And each time Dario stepped into Recovery Room B, Onyx lifted his front body with 2 slow wags of his tail, then stopped, as if he still wasn't sure he was allowed to be happy. In Manhattan, Vance Holbrook sat in his oak office and tapped his fingers against the desk. Every indirect path had been blocked. Gideon Pratt had crushed the council. Barrett had used Dr. Whitfield's assessment and Lena's notebook to stop the complaint with the State Department of Agriculture before the inspector could even get into the car, and Fletcher Boone had stopped answering Vance's calls 3 days earlier because Fletcher was smart enough to know the ship was sinking and he needed to jump before the water reached his throat. Vance had no indirect road left, and Vance Holbrook wasn't the kind of man who accepted having no road left. He chose violence. As consigliere for 12 years, Vance still had access to the Corsini Mansion's security reporting system. Access Barrett hadn't yet revoked, because Barrett didn't know Vance had copied the entire data stream onto a private hard drive 6 months earlier. At the same time, he had begun planning for the power vacuum that the bullet in Dario's shoulder was only the first step toward creating. Vance knew about the sleepwalking. He knew Dario went to the lake every night, knew what time, knew Tommy's patrol schedule, knew the northern side gate had only 1 guard from midnight to 4 o'clock in the morning. That night, at 2:15, 2 men entered from the oak woods north of the mansion, moving through the dark with the precision of people who had been given a map. They reached the side gate first. Tommy Rourke stood there, his back against a post, phone in his pocket, his eyes sweeping the woods in the 30-second cycle he had trained into reflex. He didn't see the first man. He saw the second, but half a second too late, and that half second was the entire distance between waking and unconsciousness, when something hard touched the back of his head and the world turned off the lights. 2:35. Dario Corsini got out of bed, eyes open, unaware. Gray sleep clothes, bare feet, his left shoulder still bandaged beneath his shirt, though he didn't feel it because he felt nothing at all. He was somewhere his body couldn't follow. He walked through the hallway, through the back door, across the dew-wet lawn, down the dirt road, and out to the edge of the lake. He sat down, open eyes staring at the black water, completely defenseless. 2 dark figures moved toward the lake from the oak woods. At Lakewood, 3 miles east, at 2:47 in the morning, Onyx stood up. The night shift worker, a man named Hadley who had worked at Lakewood for 6 months and had never had a night shift worth remembering, heard the sound from Recovery Room B on the camera monitor and thought this was the usual 2:47 rhythm Walt had handed over to him in the night log. The dog wakes, goes to the door, looks out the window, lies back down 15 minutes later. No intervention needed. But tonight was different. Onyx didn't scratch patiently. Onyx slammed into the door. All 140 pounds drove into the recovery room door the first time, the frame shaking, the second time, the hinges whining, the third time, the lock giving way, the door flying open and striking the wall, and Onyx ran down the hallway toward the rear door of the recovery ward, the door leading out to the fenced outdoor area. Hadley heard the crash from the staff break room, ran into the hallway, reached recovery room B, and found the door open. The room empty. 30 seconds. Onyx was already through the back fence, the same fence he had slipped through hundreds of nights before they reinforced it after the first week's incident. But reinforcement wasn't enough, against 140 pounds of absolute determination, and Onyx had found the weak point long ago, a place where the steel mesh met a concrete post, with just enough gap, if he pressed himself low and drove his shoulder through. He ran, 3 miles, blind in one eye, through the night, through oak woods and dirt road and dew-wet grass, by a body memory that had recorded every tree root, every bend, every scent along the route he had run hundreds of times. 140 pounds moving through the dark with a precision created not by training but by loyalty. The kind of loyalty that kept running when everything else had stopped, when the left eye was gone, when the fence had been reinforced, when the door was locked. Loyalty that didn't know how to turn itself off. The lakeshore. Dario sat at the water's edge, eyes open, seeing nothing. The 2 dark figures were 20 meters behind him, moving closer, and the man in front had drawn a knife. Onyx reached them first. No bark, no growl, no warning. Absolute silence. 140 pounds hit the first dark figure from the right with the full momentum of a creature that had run 3 miles without slowing down, and the man fell, the knife flying from his hand, his head striking the ground. The second assassin turned, drew a gun, and fired. The bullet tore through the right side of Onyx's chest, but the momentum of 140 pounds didn't stop because of one bullet. The body kept driving forward, jaws open, locking onto the second assassin's gun hand, and both of them went down together, the gun falling, and the impact as Onyx crashed to the ground twisted his spine at an angle bone was never designed to bear. A second injury in 1 second, the bullet in his chest, and the spine breaking at the same time. The gunshot woke Dario, not gradually, but instantly. The violent waking of a sleepwalker when sound is loud enough to tear sleep apart instead of gently pulling him out of it, and he found himself sitting at the edge of the lake in sleep clothes, bare feet in wet grass, and in front of him on the lawn, beneath the moonlight, Onyx lay on the ground, black fur wet with something darker than dew. Tommy Rourke woke up on the cold ground at the side gate, with blood running from the back of his head down into his collar, and the world spinning in his eyes like a camera lens gone out of focus. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, but he heard the gunshot still echoing in his ears. An instinct trained into him for 12 years dragged him upright before his mind had finished processing the pain. He ran toward the lake, his legs unsteady on the wet grass, and what he saw beneath the moonlight was Dario kneeling on the ground beside Onyx, his right hand on the dog's neck, black blood wet on the grass, and 2 strange men lying on the lawn about 10 meters away, one unconscious, the other moaning while clutching a broken arm. Tommy called veterinary emergency services first, human emergency services second, and that decision said everything that needed to be said about the order of priorities in his head at 3 o'clock in the morning, with blood running down his neck and his boss kneeling in the grass beside the dog. The veterinary ambulance came from the emergency hospital in Westchester in 28 minutes. 28 minutes in which Dario didn't stand, didn't leave the place where Onyx lay, his right hand staying on the dog's neck, while mansion security arrived to restrain the second assassin, and Tommy temporarily bandaged the wound on his own head with his jacket. Onyx was lifted into the veterinary ambulance. Dario got into the sedan Tommy drove behind it, and the convoy tore through the Hudson Valley night toward Westchester, at a speed where red lights became suggestions instead of rules. Westchester Emergency Veterinary Hospital, 3:42 in the morning. The bullet had passed through the right side of the chest near the lung, and there was spinal trauma from the impact when he fell. The 4-person surgical team prepared the operating room in 10 minutes, and Dr. Whitfield arrived at 4 o'clock, called from home by Barrett Hale, who had received the news from Tommy and was on his way up from Manhattan. Dr. Whitfield wasn't the lead surgeon. She came to assist, to provide Onyx's medical history to the surgical team, and she stood in the operating room for the next 4 hours, because she had monitored this dog for 3 weeks, and she wasn't going to let anyone cut into him without someone who knew him standing beside him. Lena arrived at 4:15. Tommy had called her. 3 words. Onyx was shot. She drove from Peekskill to Westchester in 26 minutes, a drive that usually took 40, wearing sleep clothes, hair tangled, eyes red, and her hand clenched around the hard-covered notebook she had shoved into her jacket pocket. before locking her studio door, because it was reflex now. She carried that notebook everywhere. It was an extension of her hand by then. She sat outside the operating room on a white plastic hospital chair, the kind of chair like the one at Lakewood, like the chairs in every place where people sat waiting for news about something they loved and couldn't control. Dario sat beside her, gray sleep clothes, bare feet hastily shoved into the shoes Tommy had thrown to him on the way to the car, and blood on the sleeve of his sleep shirt, Onyx's blood, black and dry, and clotted into the gray fabric at his right wrist, where he had kept his hand on the dog's neck through the 28 minutes waiting for the ambulance. For the first time, they sat beside each other without the glass door of an isolation room between them, without the roles of delivery girl and kingpin, without any battle over her father or the docks or Apex or anything that belonged to the world outside. Just two people, sitting on white plastic chairs at 4 o'clock in the morning, waiting for news about a living creature they both loved in different ways, but loved from the same place. They sat in silence for 30 minutes. Then Dario spoke, his voice hoarse and low, the voice of a man who hadn't said anything since waking at the edge of the lake, and now the words came out with difficulty, as if they had to pass through something very thick to reach his mouth. He ran 3 miles, blind in one eye, in the dark. Lena looked at the wall across from them. He ran 3 miles every night for a whole month, she said, just to sit beside you. Silence. Longer than the silence before. Heavier, but different. Not the silence between two people keeping distance, but the silence between two people who had just realized the distance had narrowed on its own, without anyone giving it permission. Dario said, very softly, so softly Lena had to lean closer to hear him, "I don't deserve that." Lena looked at him, looked at Onyx's blood on the sleeve of his sleep shirt, looked at his bare feet in shoes without socks, looked at the face whose mask had fallen sometime without her noticing, leaving only the face of a 37-year-old man sitting in a veterinary hospital at 4 o'clock in the morning. "That wasn't your decision," she said. "It was his. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 4 hours of surgery." Barrett arrived at 5, sat in the row of seats across from them, and said nothing. Tommy sat in the corner of the hallway with a white bandage wrapped around his head and his eyes wide open because he refused to take pain medication until he knew the outcome. At 7:11, the operating room door opened. Dr. Whitfield stepped out, removing her gloves, her face tired but not the face of someone carrying the worst news. "Onyx is alive," she said. Then she said the rest, the part no one in the hallway wanted to hear, but everyone knew was coming. The bullet had been removed. The lung hadn't been punctured because the rib had blocked it, but the spinal trauma from the impact when he fell had caused irreversible nerve damage in the lower back, paralysis of the hind legs, permanent. The giant black dog, blind in one eye because he had jumped in front of a bullet 2 years earlier, now had hind legs that would never run again because he had run his last 3 miles through the dark to reach the right place at the right moment and save the person he had never stopped waiting for. Dario rose from the plastic chair, walked to the operating room door, and looked inside. Lena didn't look after him. She opened her notebook, held the blue ballpoint pen, and wrote with a hand that still hadn't stopped shaking. 7:11 in the morning, Onyx alive, permanent paralysis in hind legs, 2 assassins captured alive. Tommy caught one after waking. Mansion security caught one. Both gave the same name under interrogation. Vance Holbrook. The 2 assassins talked within 48 hours. Not because the Corsini organization's interrogation methods were especially refined, but because both of them had been hired from outside, had no loyalty to anyone, and when faced with the choice between staying silent for Vance Holbrook and talking to stay alive, that calculation didn't take long. Both pointed to the same man, the same contact number, the same payment method through an account that Barrett Hale traced over 2 days back to a shell company Vance had used for 12 years, for expenses that didn't appear in the family books. And when the financial records of that shell company were opened, they didn't contain only the payment for the 2 assassins from the week before. They contained another payment, 10 years earlier, the same pattern, the same structure, payment for a service at the Yonkers docks on the Friday night. Frank Mercer fell from pier number 7 into the water and never came back up. Dario summoned the family council to the conference room on the 15th floor on Park Avenue, the same room Gideon Pratt had walked into uninvited 3 weeks earlier. This time, Gideon didn't need to come. This time, Dario sat at the head of the table, his left shoulder still in a sling, his face carrying the cold, controlled look of the man in the photograph Tommy had given Lena, but his eyes held something else. Something Lena, standing in the corner of the room because Dario had asked her to be there and she hadn't asked why, recognized as the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much betrayal to be surprised anymore, but hadn't grown hard enough to stop feeling it. The decision was made in 11 minutes. Vance Holbrook was stripped of every right within the Corsini family, every asset tied to the organization was seized, and Dario handed his entire black market paper trail over to the federal authorities. Vance wouldn't be leaving New York. He would spend the remainder of his life in a maximum security cell, buried alive by the very system he thought he controlled. No killing. Lena stood in the corner of the room and watched Dario make that decision, and she knew by the way she had learned to read his face through their brief encounters, that the old Dario would have killed Vance. Dario before Onyx, before the linoleum floor, before 3 o'clock in the morning at the Westchester Veterinary Hospital, that Dario wouldn't have allowed Vance to leave the conference room on his own 2 feet. But Dario was changing, not changing like in a movie. Not waking up one morning and becoming someone else. Only small shifts, slow, painful, in places no one could see except those standing close enough, and Lena was standing close enough. 3 days after the council meeting, Dario called Lena to the mansion. Not Tommy, not Barrett. Dario called directly, and it was the first time she had heard his voice on the phone, lower than she had imagined, calmer, and he only said, "I have something that belongs to you. You should come get it." She drove to the mansion, and Dario was waiting in the first-floor study, the room with windows looking out over the lake she now could never look at without thinking of 2:47 in the morning. He handed her a file folder, not through Tommy, not through Barrett, but with his own hand. Inside the file, evidence from Vance's shell company, the payment link to the Yonkers docks, dates matching the night her father died, and a copy of the internal report Vance had hidden for 10 years, proving that Frank Mercer had been killed because he discovered contraband in warehouse number 3 and planned to call the police. "Your father deserved the truth," Dario said. "You deserve to choose what to do with it." Lena held the file folder. It was heavier than she expected, or maybe her hand was lighter than usual. "It'll lead back to you," she said. "Not a threat, not a warning, only the truth, because the docks belong to the Corsinis, and any investigation reopened into Frank Mercer's case would follow the line from Vance, to the docks, to the organization, to Dario. Maybe," he said, and he still handed it to her. Lena drove back to Peekskill with the file folder on the passenger seat. The small studio, the kitchen table, the desk lamp, the plate of food she had reheated from yesterday cooling beside her elbow as she opened the folder and began to read. Page by page, her hands shook, not from fear, but because 10 years were shrinking into lines on paper, shaking because her grandmother had been right. Paper stayed, and now paper was telling her how her father had really died. Not the 4 paragraphs in the Yonkers Daily that no one read, but the truth with money and dates, and a name she had heard Dario say in the hallway at Lakewood 3 weeks earlier. Fletcher Boone submitted his resignation at Lakewood the next day. No ceremony, no farewell email, just a letter on Dr. Whitfield's desk and an empty parking space in the staff lot. Losing Vance meant losing his patron, and Fletcher was smart enough to know that the building Vance had built for him had lost its foundation. Dr. Whitfield took over as director of Lakewood the following week, and the first thing she did wasn't changing procedures or rewriting the employee handbook. It was calling Lena. "I need a part-time animal behavior consultant," she said. "No formal degree required. On-site training. Are you interested?" Lena sat at the kitchen table in her Peekskill studio, the phone pressed to her ear, and looked at 3 things on the chair across from her. The faded Apex jacket with the logo she had worn for 3 years without knowing who it belonged to. The $1 hard-covered notebook with 23 pages of blue ballpoint notes that Dr. Whitfield had cited in the official behavioral assessment sent to the State Department of Agriculture, and the offer letter from the place where, 3 weeks earlier, its director had stood over her and told her to get off his floor. "Yes," she said. 6 months after the night at the lakeshore, Onyx came home to the Corsini mansion. A private room on the first floor, warm carpet under him, a large window looking straight out at the lake he had run to hundreds of nights on 4 legs, and now watched from behind glass with the only eye he had left. A special dog wheelchair held his hind legs, a lightweight steel frame with wheels that Dr. Whitfield had ordered from an animal rehabilitation facility in Pennsylvania. And Onyx took 2 weeks to get used to it. 2 weeks in which Lena came to the mansion every day and sat on the floor beside him while he learned to move with his 2 front legs and 2 wheels, falling, getting up, falling, getting up. Patient in the way only a creature who had already lost enough could be patient, because he had nothing left to lose except the act of trying. Lena worked at Lakewood now, a part-time animal behavior consultant, studying for an official certification through the on-site training program Dr. Whitfield had designed specifically for her, and she still drove the lakeside delivery route 2 days a week because she liked the early mornings on that road, liked the way the first light of day touched the lake before it touched anything else, and perhaps because that road was where she had first seen the shadowed figure by the water and hadn't stopped. And now, every time she drove past, she stopped. Not because the shadow was still there, but because she had learned that stopping was a choice she wouldn't pass by a second time. Dario was still Dario, cold, calculating, sitting behind the oak desk in the first-floor study, reading financial reports with the eyes of a man who looked at numbers and saw power instead of money. Still the boss, still the kingpin, still the man who made everyone in a room recalculate their place the moment he walked in. But he was being treated for sleepwalking by a neurologist in Manhattan, something Lena had spent 3 weeks arguing him into, along with 4 dinners neither of them ate, because they were too busy fighting, and in the end he agreed, not because she won the argument, but because Onyx could no longer run 3 miles to save him, and he owed the dog at least this much, to stop walking out to the lake unconsciously every night. He used the profits from a warehouse in the Bronx to officially fund Lakewood, the first legal grant the Corsini organization made under its real name. And when Barrett asked why, Dario looked out the window toward the lake and didn't answer. He didn't kill Vance. That was the greatest change, and also the change no one outside could see, because the world only saw Vance disappear and didn't ask why. But Lena knew that the decision not to kill was the most expensive decision Dario had ever made, more expensive than any grant, because in his world, not killing meant owing, and Dario Corsini wasn't a man used to owing anyone. What stood between them wasn't a fairy tale. There was no kiss in the rain, no confession beneath the sunset, only quiet evenings beside the lake where they sat 1 foot apart and said nothing, and early mornings when Lena watched Dario read financial reports and thought about her father and didn't know what she felt, and moments when his hand touched hers while they were both stroking Onyx's back, and neither of them pulled away. Uneven, complicated, full of things unsaid, but real, and moving forward. A March morning, cold and bright, the air smelling of damp leaves and wet earth after a light rain in the night. The back steps of the Corsini mansion, granite steps overlooking the lake, whose morning surface lay flat as a mirror and reflected the pale gray sky slowly turning blue. Lena sat on the left, a cup of coffee in her hand, the hard-covered notebook on her lap. Dario sat on the right, a second cup of coffee, white shirt sleeves rolled up, bare feet on the cold stone, because he was still the kind of man who didn't wear shoes when he didn't have to, and between them lay Onyx. His massive black head rested on Lena's lap, heavy and warm, the scar over his left eye fading beneath the black fur slowly growing back, his hind legs stretched in the wheelchair whose wheels shone because Walt had polished them the week before, and his right eye was closed, not because he was sleeping, but because he didn't need to keep it open. Everything he needed was here, on both sides of him, and he knew it by scent and warmth and the breathing rhythms he had learned by heart. Onyx made a sound, deep, low, soft, vibrating at the back of his throat. The sound Dr. Whitfield recorded in her clinical report as content vocalization, the sound of a creature who wasn't hurting, wasn't afraid, wasn't waiting, only existing where he belonged, beside the people he had chosen. Dario placed his right hand on Onyx's back, lightly, carefully, as if he were learning how to touch something without breaking it, because Dario Corsini had spent his entire life touching everything with force and control, and now he was learning that some things needed an open hand instead of a fist. Lena opened the notebook, held the blue ballpoint pen, and wrote the final line in the notebook her grandmother had taught her to use when she was 9 years old. March morning. Onyx. Content vocalization. Duration. Ongoing. She closed the notebook, drank her coffee. The lake reflected the sky. No one needed to explain anything. There is a lesson this story leaves behind if you sit with it long enough, the way Lena sat on the linoleum floor long enough for Onyx to decide for himself. Never look at a living creature in pain and call it dangerous, because behind every act of violence, there is always a pain no one has bothered to ask about, because real strength doesn't live in power or money, or in how many people fear you, but in the ability to sit still long enough to see the truth everyone else has ignored. Because healing isn't a destination, it is a direction, and Onyx will never run again. Dario still has to treat his sleepwalking every week. Lena is still an orphan. No one in this story is cured, but all of them are moving forward together, and that is enough. If this story stays in your heart, please like it so it can find someone else who needs to hear it. Share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel to hear more heart-touching stories every day. We want to know how this story made you feel, what it reminded you of in your real life, whether you've ever looked at someone in pain and mistaken it for danger, whether you've ever been Lena sitting on the floor, waiting for a broken creature to decide for itself whether to trust you. Please write it in the comments below, because we read every line, and every story you share is precious to us from the bottom of our hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in every day. Thank you for staying until the very last minute. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.